Alright, this is the FRQ from April 20th. This is question 2. I'm just going to go through and identify a couple common mistakes that I saw. First recommendation for any sort of banking balance sheet problem is that you assess the information you have before you get started. So in this case, this is what we're starting with. We checked the intro. Nothing interesting. We skim down the balance sheet. We look at reserves, and we look at demand deposits. This other stuff is noise because the AP never asks about it. In real life, all of those other line items can be quite important, but for our purposes, they're not. And then we find that there's a 10% reserve requirement. So 10% times 20,000 gets us 2,000. Make this a little bit easier to read. And we notice that we have 5,000 in reserves. So this reserves must be total reserves, which means required reserves are 2,000 and excess reserves are 3,000, equaling 5,000 in total. So now if we move to the problems, A, we've already calculated that. 2, for B, we know that ER equals our additional loan, so this will be 3,000 for B. And this C is where it gets a little bit tricky. If we assume that the money multiplier is 10%, so 1 over point equals 10, and we can make 3,000 in loans, 10 times 3,000 equals 30,000. So far, so good. And in this case, there are no new demand deposits as part of this problem, so we only start with the excess reserves of this Raymond Bank and go from there. And then total reserves through the banking system. This could be super complicated, or you can simplify and know that demand deposits anywhere in the banking system, so our 30,000, will require a 10% reserve against it. So in this case, we know that 10% times 30,000 would get you 3,000, and that's also what we started with as far as the excess reserves. So those reserves used to be just in Raymond Bank, but as they spread out through the banking system, it became piecemeal required reserves in every place. And one way to think about it, if you want to go through the entire process, this first 3,000 became a loan of 3,000, and the first bank it went into, they reserved 300, and then they were able to lend 2,700. And then that 2,700, the next bank would keep 270 in required reserves, and then they would be able to lend 2,430. The process would continue. So in this case, the change in total reserves throughout the system would be 0. And then the last question, because the government securities are owned by the bank itself, not a customer of the bank, when they sell them, the money they receive is the bank's cash, not customer cash. And because it's not customer cash, it's not a demand deposit, which means they're not required to keep any required reserves against it. So in this case, required reserves will not change. And the reason being, the sale of the government securities does not result in a demand deposit. The sale of government securities results in cash for the bank itself, because the government securities were owned by the bank in the first place.